Thank you very much. It is a tremendous honor and pleasure to be here today for what, as Jonathan has just said, will be the first in a series of presentations. Before I start and indicate to you as concisely as possible how I organized the progression, how I hope to be able to organize the progression of these different presentations, I want to express a very deep gratitude to the Humanities Center, Jonathan Arek himself, Todd Reeser, Tori Doer, and their other colleagues and collaborators who have organized this visit, and also, of course, all the other agencies and institutions who sponsored the invitation. It's, I repeat, a great honor and an enormous pleasure for me. Now, yes, I think I'll, as quickly as possible, go into the subject of today's lecture. Let me simply recall what you may have seen on the website that Jonathan was indicating, or that what you may see later. Excuse me, I always have difficult problems of accommodation, ocular. That apart from other meetings and talks, which I was very happy to accept, the main, the central part of my program here is made of 5 successive presentations, which are divided into 2 categories. There is an opening lecture today on the subject that Jonathan just recalled. Rights, what's the next second term? I already forgot. Okay. Sorry, differences, yes. Differences and exclusions. There will be on Friday, I believe, yes, Friday next week, a concluding lecture, also public, but in a different venue from what I understand, with the impossible title, Thinking the Impossible Human. In the meantime, I will be conducting, probably with a more limited audience. I don't know. Of course, I'd be extremely happy to meet with any of you who is interested. I will be conducting 3 colloquia, is it how they were called? So in a seminar room on subjects which I want to briefly present at the end of this initial lecture. Therefore, I'm not going to give the titles again now. Now, of course, for me, at least, this is a very nice way of doing things, because it gives me, hopefully, the possibility to go a little deeper into the details of some of the issues that I'm currently working on. This is very much a work in progress with colleagues and students in the form of colloquia, from which I'm sure I will benefit to prepare the final lecture. But indeed, I must try to give these 2 public lectures a form that is sufficiently, I would say, autonomous for them to to give an idea of the general guiding thread of this research, and make a discussion possible. Now we'll see if I succeed in doing that, but this was all to explain that, of course, I will try to present today an argument that can be already discussed, but it has a preliminary function, and for that reason it is also perhaps still a little abstract. Now, I had contemplated different possibilities for the subject of this series of lectures and seminars, and in the end I thought that I should not miss the occasion to submit to your reactions and criticisms a bunch of hypotheses that have been accompanying my work for a long period of time now, and as I was trying on the one hand to assess what I called in my jargon, I must admit this is a jargon, the trace of equal liberty. I even ventured, of course, equal liberty is a formula that can be traced back to Cicero and has a long history behind it, and has been repeatedly central in philosophical discussions, both in the classical age and more recently in the work of John Rawls and others after him. But I ventured myself into coining a portmanteau expression which fortunately works in English and not only in French, that is equal liberty in one single word, to express the strong reciprocity that I see between these two values or categories in the history of modern constitutionalism. In other words, I was trying to assess the contradictory effects more than ever observable today of a political discourse whose source of legitimacy resides in a hyperbolic universalistic proclamation or declaration of unlimited access to the citizens' rights for, in the principle, every human being, or perhaps every adult human being, but this is already a problem of anthropological difference. And I was trying, on the other hand, to trace a genealogy of the modern, perhaps we should say also Western, philosophical subject, a figure subjected, an interesting, of course, also in my view, important play on words, to all sorts of critiques and deconstructions in contemporary philosophy. Excuse me, I seem to be hesitant, but this is because I'm really sorry of that. I now have, the microphone between the two eyes, so it produces strabism. Okay. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, that should work like that. And, I was trying to trace a genealogy of the modern Western philosophical subject, a figure subjected, I read, to all sorts of critiques and deconstructions in contemporary philosophy, but which precisely for that reason remains the focal point of metaphysical thought. In a hardly original manner, it was the specific relationship between the central or sovereign function of this subject and the enunciation of the universal, be it a cognitive universal or a moral one, as you find it typically expressed in Kant's philosophy, but also in other ones before or after him, that interested me. I wanted to understand the latent tensions or even contradictions that affect this ideal correspondence between the singular agency and consciousness of the subject and the horizon of universality, or what you can call in Foucauldian terms, to which I will return probably in the final lecture, the empirical or empiricist transcendental doublet, which is also clearly one of the most cogent expressions of modern humanism. But I also wanted to understand the specific relationship that can be identified between the universality of the philosophical subject, or the philosophical representation of the subject as singular instantiation, not to say incarnation of the universal, which is certainly not deprived of practical, institutional, or cultural consequences, and, excuse me, the phrase is long, and the political revolution that the representation of the universal had undergone in modern times, inasmuch as it became a political universal, or perhaps more precisely, a civic, what I would call a civic universal, or civic universality. A universal whose foundation is not, or no longer primarily, a theological or cosmological derivation of the human, but a direct recognition of the natural entitlement of human beings and human groups to accessing and to access, and participation, or at least representation in the public sphere. Which takes me back to my first consideration, the trace of equal liberty or equal liberty. My hypothesis was and remains that the modern so-called sovereign subject, the one for whom the whole field of natural and historical experience is potentially accessible in the form of rational explanations, and whose ethical values or imperatives or interests make it possible to imagine humankind as a virtual community without exclusions, is indeed a citizen subject. That is, a human subject whose modalities of subjection, including his or her relations to life, natural conditions, other humans, are henceforth modified, reshaped, redefined through his or her virtual inclusion in the reciprocities of citizenship, or as Rousseau would put it, the associations of citizenship. But also one, still the same subject or citizen subject, whose subjective qualities precisely, that is moral, intellectual, even affective and physical capacities, whose conscious and perhaps even unconscious determinations derive from the logic of civic inclusion and civic universality, or to be more cautious, become intelligible only in relationship to that symbolic structure, has so many ways to express its implications, but also to react to its impossible, sometimes, demands, and perhaps to make choices within its constraints. In other terms, my hypothesis was and remains that the category of the subject underwent a revolution in modern times, Copernican or not. And this revolution could not be understood neither in its content nor its implications by simply passing from one subjective figure to another, for instance, from a subject as rational animal or divine creature endowed with a body and a soul, to a subject as self-reflective, conscious being or responsible proprietor of his own person, I ask you here not to immediately challenge my grammatical use of the masculine to refer to the generic subject most of the time, which of course is not innocent, but will not remain, as you will see, undisputed. But it should be understood through, this transformation of this revolutionary change that the category of subject has undergone in modern times, through the interposition of or the interaction with another revolution, that which affected the political by disqualifying at the level of values and principles the idea of any natural or predestined discriminations, which would mean that some humans are essentially superior, discriminations which would mean that some humans are essentially superior to others, or that some are destined to rule over others, to exercise authority by birthright. The political revolution I'm talking about, an expression which certainly evokes determinate events and discursive productions, especially in such countries as the United States of America or France, but which in my intention would also refer to a broader general tendency of Western modernity, should be considered or considered again, reintroduced against both a certain history of metaphysics, which only too easily brackets these political dimensions, and a certain sociological tradition as well, as the mediating factor in the genealogy of the subject, or the subject form. Not a vanishing mediator, but an institutional mediator made of practices, struggles, power relations, as well as ideas and discourses. Now, these very abstract preliminaries call for two series of qualifications and rectifications, which will only then take me to what is for today my proper subject. The first, on which I try to be as quick as possible, not because I consider them unimportant, but because they could very well prevent me from ever getting to my more substantial point, concern the epistemological status of this idea of a mediating or dialectical relationship between a symbolic revolution affecting the category or the concept of the subject and a political revolution, for which the names of subject and citizen, however inevitable, are also clearly still much too simple. What I discuss here is certainly an ideal construction, an ideal type, if you like, which strategically selects a certain problem but could easily be counteracted by other narratives. But above all, the linear presentation that I am following is misleading, and it would become even more such if it was understood to mean that, in my opinion, the constitutive features of the modern subject, qua philosophical subject, say the Kantian subject, but here already you might ask, why this privilege? Why not rather the Lockean or the Benthamian or the Hegelian subject, etc.? For one, expresses or reflects ideologically the political transformation that creates the citizen. And here again, why the citizen? Why not the bourgeois, the capitalist, etc.? I shall return to this. And for two, follows entirely from a political revolution that can be located as a single event. I am fully aware, I try never to forget it, that there is a long history of Western metaphysics, which is not even purely European, where the philosophical categories and arguments which become integrated in the competing concepts of the modern subject, qua self-consciousness and proprietor in one's person, must be traced back. For instance, in the classical notions of the soul as a mirror of the universe, or the relationship of appropriation that in the Stoic tradition existed between an individual and his or her environment through the mediation of their body. And I am fully aware that what I call the civic revolution, or the revolution leading to a political universalization of rights, qua human rights, is a long, complicated, uneven process stretching over centuries, passing through very different stages nationally, where the conspicuous revolutionary episodes, such as the French or the American, with their performative declarations of rights in the name of we the people or la nation, represent mythical or mythopoietic moments of crystallization of the collective imaginary as much as actual social and institutional transformations. But these complexities, which I summarize, or of which I give an idea to avoid misunderstandings of what I'm trying to do not cancel, at least I do hope so, that there can be an intellectual benefit in pulling or drawing from the parallel transformations in the conceptual and the institutional histories elements for delineating a problem, or if you like, an aporia that seems to constitute at the same time the driving impulse for the universality construction of the subject and the latent cause for its never achieved or achievable consistency. This leads me to my second rectification or precaution, which is in fact much more important. What I want to discuss, in fact, is not a harmonious correspondence between modern universalism based on a humanist theory of natural rights and their more or less perfect translation into institutional terms, and a category of the subject which is itself universalistic, therefore abstract, or again in Kantian terms, transcendental, that is, identified in first instance with a generic reflective capacity, an I think, which, as Kant would write in his first critique, should be supposed as the origin of all our representations. What I want to discuss is not this nice correspondence or harmony. It is rather an inadequation of this subject with itself, or a relationship of uneasiness, an admirable Lockean concept, anticipating in some respects Freud's Unbehagen, discontent, which could be generalized, existing within the subject or between the subject and itself, that is, its own thinking, its own affects or desires, its own property or propriety, but also its others. Therefore, preventing it or him or her from what Hegel will call recognition or mutual recognition. Therefore, identification or full, unquestionable identification with its own universal concept, to which it remains nevertheless attached. As a consequence, the modern subject is and is not the instantiation of the universal, or it's a defective instantiation, if you like. Therefore, it is for itself the problem of this contradictory relationship to the universal. But above all, I want to articulate this uneasiness of the subject with a deeper contradiction located at the very heart of the civic universal, which I present as a contradiction between a certain removal of anthropological differences as possible foundations for a segregated and hierarchic constitution of the body politic. For example, the fact that in a society, in a pre-modern society, you have masters and servants, and the first are naturally entitled to rule, whereas the others are automatically located in the place of obedience or subjection. So a removal of such anthropological differences as foundations for a segregated and hierarchic constitution of the body politic, implying that the multitude which now assembles into a people or forms the constituent power of a state is undifferentiated, sharing only the same human essence or exemplifying the same moral personhood. And a reinstallation of the anthropological differences, say differences of sex or gender, age, health, intellectual capacities, morality, race, culture, etc., as so many criteria for institutionalizing, that is, legalizing, socially and culturally constructing, but even also metaphysically justifying unequal access to citizenship or to active citizenship, and particularly public functions and participation in the sovereign. Therefore, like it or not, and this is, of course, a complete paradox, unequal distribution of equal rights, or even, to put it in Arendtian terms, unequal distribution of the universal right to have rights. This is a blatant contradiction, indeed, and it is also a violent one in practice, which I suggest never ceased to politically undermine modern universalism or civic universalism, also accounting for the constitutive uneasiness of the modern subject, because this subject was constructed essentially as a secular civic capacity. Of course, there are plenty of examples of the uneasiness being displaced or relativized or expressed in forms which at the same time involve a recognition and a certain amount of neutralization. For instance, in Kant, I return once again to Kant, even very schematically, in Kant's so-called pragmatic anthropology, the anthropological differences discussed at length, which are considered irrelevant from the point of view of the definition of the universal transcendental subject, such as racial, ethnic, sexual differences, are reinstalled in a second moment as so-called empirical characters of the human, which become essential objects for the normalization of the civic society through such processes and institutions as education, marriage, commerce, etc. But this does not reflect, in my opinion, it's very interesting, but it does not reflect the core of the intrinsic contradiction. It represents rather a form of its displacement. In order to be able to defend and discuss my hypothesis, which I finally express now, namely that the modern universality, based on a symbolic correlation between human rights and civic rights, or rights to have rights, pushes the contradiction between the principle of equality and the recognition of differences to an extreme form, where it is at the same time impossible and nevertheless inevitable, symbolically denied, and practically omnipresent. I will have to take several successive steps going into more or less detailed arguments. Allow me to rapidly summarize them in advance. First, I must discuss whether this is a contradiction that is intrinsic to the civic universal, inherent in its constitution, or only, so to speak, a product of the imperfect conditions in which it is enunciated and implemented, or the powerful... I'm too close to that, no? That's okay? No. Or the powerful social, ideological obstacles, better like that, no? No longer working? The powerful social, ideological obstacles which it confronts in the modernization of society. Second, I must discuss whether there is an essential difference between discriminations based on anthropological differences, such as gender and race, in democratic societies, whose constitutions are based on universalistic principles of equality, and discriminations involved in hierarchic representations of unequal statuses as a constitutive condition of the social and political order. In other terms, I must justify the paradoxical idea that modernity creates forms of internal exclusion that are, in a sense, more radical than previous societies which were officially inequalitarian. Third, I must at least briefly indicate why I grant privilege to a civic definition of the universal in the discussion of exclusion and discrimination, whereas other references are indeed thinkable, in particular references to the monotheistic discourse, of which the discourse of universal human rights could be, in a sense, considered a secularized version, or to the universal pattern of equivalences between commodities generalized by capitalism, or to the constitution of a Eurocentric, more generally Western-dominated imperial world system, could be equally, whereas these references could be equally relevant. All these discussions, only partially sketched, of course, will lead me to a synthetic hypothesis which suggests that the simultaneous denial and radicalization of anthropological differences in modernity can be interpreted in terms of the contradictory requisites of building communities of citizens in the modern sense, that is, instituting the universal as an actual principle for the community, particularly a legal one. From there, I will proceed to a more refined consideration of the elusive pattern of anthropological differences in modernity, from where I wish to be able to return in conclusion to the issue of the subject. So first step, why not simply assume that universalistic principles, in this case it would be more adequate to call them ideas or regulatory ideas, are inevitably contradicted by empirical realities? This is, I must admit, the point of view which has come to be largely accepted, at least in the liberal tradition, and inasmuch as certain discriminations are concerned, probably not all of them. It is the product of a retrospective view of history, which we take from today, in which a certain idea of progress is essentially embodied. One is aware that the founding fathers of the United States of America essentially thought that slavery was compatible with the Constitution of Liberty, or even believed its preservation was a consequence of the absolute character of the property right, which itself founded the independence of the citizen. Retrospectively, that is, in the light of the Civil War and the abolition of slavery and the subsequent campaigns for civic rights of the black population, this appears as a contradiction between the idea and the historical circumstances. Slavery, however renewed by the modern trade, belonged, we believe to understand, to an archaic tradition based on despotic values and, of course, relied also on powerful material interests, which civic universalism could not immediately overcome. Conversely, the fact that after the abolition of slavery, race discriminations were reinstalled and even today are not completely suppressed in spite of many civil rights movements would testify for the fact that prejudices, traditions, and power interests are competing here with the universalistic principles, or help keep them at a purely symbolic level, precisely. In a similar manner, we are aware that the French Revolution proclaimed citizenship as a universal right, even with a very interesting cosmopolitical dimension, only to combine it immediately with a triple limitation, or better said, in the last two cases at least, exclusion, distinguishing first-class citizens, called active, from second-class citizens, called passive, after tax criteria which amounted to raising the property owners above the wage laborers, suppressing violently the slaves' revolution, which in Haiti had immediately claimed for themselves the universal rights proclaimed in France, and ultimately, in fact, simultaneously from the chronological point of view, rejecting the civic rights of women which had been vindicated both inside and outside France as a logical consequence of the revolutionary principles. This last configuration is especially meaningful to me, and in fact it supports my interpretation, which I hope can be shared by at least some historians. No doubt the inequalities and exclusions traced back to a long past. It was certainly a question of maintaining them, not of creating them. But they could be maintained only at the condition of becoming reiterated and, in fact, recreated in new terms, in a new language. Or to put it the other way around, from the moment when the political power, even the sovereign power, was declared a property of the people, that is, of all, it was only on the condition of reiterating the principle of exclusion from within the universal itself as a negative consequence of its own validity that some categories of subjects, including workers, women, slaves, or colonized subjects, could be internally excluded or disqualified. Even if this simply maintained in practice an already existing domination, it required an additional justification, itself universalistic, as it were. And it is in this sense that I propose that the exclusion becomes now more radical, and for that reason also more violent. But this is also because, seen from the other angle, such a justification, however rational in its formulation, is bound to remain illegitimate in the very sense in which Max Weber, in his extraordinary essay called The City, explains that democracy is an illegitimate form of domination. That is, one that cannot live without conflict, remain uncontroversial or uncontested. The exclusions from civil rights within a foundational paradigm of human rights, of universal human rights, are bound to become contested on the very basis of these rights, that is, to be experienced and presented as a contradiction. Workers, slaves, women will denounce the contradiction, claim equality and inclusion in the name of the universalistic principles whose benefits they have been denied, and they will struggle in various ways to suppress the contradiction. And it is inasmuch as they succeed in this struggle, sometimes after long and uncertain battles, which can take decades or even centuries, sometimes only in a partial or merely formal manner, that retrospectively it can appear that the line of progress amounted to, in Hegelian terms, negating the negation, cancelling the exclusions from citizenship, or some of them, because there are which are never cancelled, the child, the criminal, for different reasons, never become, in fact, full citizens. But in the time of the conflict, of its unresolved uncertainty, the inclusive and exclusive sides of universalism remain in absolute, and I repeat most of the time, violent clashing. And it is the structure of this conflict that I try to describe as an intrinsic dimension of civic universalism. Of course, not universalism as simple idea, but also as historical institution. This leads me to my second step. Why is there a difference between the status, therefore also the very definition or understanding of anthropological differences in societies and polities that are principally equalitarian on one side and hierarchic ones on the other side? Again, I'm not suggesting that our democratic societies are not permeated and mixed with all sorts of hierarchic traditions and representations. But I'm trying to identify a principle that makes a difference within the differences, or the perception of the differences, so to speak. It seems to me that a quick comparison with the principles of ancient, particularly Greek citizenship, as expressed in a fairly accurate manner by Aristotle, who, to say it in passing, is not only a great anthropologist, but in fact a structuralist, that is, precisely a theorist of differences and oppositions which make account for the consistency of a totality, can help clarifying the relevant point. In the city, or the Greek city, as described by Aristotle, political participation involves a very strong notion of reciprocity of rights and duties, therefore equality among citizens. But citizenship, as we know, can exist only among those who are already equal by nature, that is, adult men, and in practice, masters of the households, who discuss among themselves on the public place. The reverse side, which is also presented by Aristotle in a very materialistic manner as the necessary precondition of citizenship, or its dependence, its relation of dependence to life, is the fact that unequal social relations, which are also unequal by nature, of course, those which rest on dissymmetric relations to authority, language, and life, such as the relation between men and women, or male and female humans, adults and children, and masters and slaves, are instituted outside the public space in a segregated private space. In other terms, the various anthropological categories are categories of different humans or different types of humans whose complementarity forms the human species and whose natural differences account for differential or unequal inclusion in the political. In contradistinction, I believe that exclusions from modern citizenship, however rooted they can remain in ancient, very old, in fact, patterns of domination, patriarchy and so on, tend to become justified in a different manner, which indeed is much more violent. If a natural right entitles every human being to become incorporated into the polity, or at least represented in its government, but to be represented you must participate in a basically equalitarian assembly, which is called the constituent power. And if power relations exist or have to be created which prevent some from accessing citizenship, this can be only because some humans are not properly human, or are less than human, or less perfectly human than others, who, so to speak, exclude themselves from the line of progress. This is how I interpret the fact that modernity has a tendency to naturalize anthropological differences, not in terms of complementarities, but in terms of deficiencies, which themselves are inscribed in universalistic patterns of evolution, describing the human species as a collective being evolving towards its own perfection only with uneven capacities and a permanent risk of falling back under its own criteria of normality. Thus, women excluded from citizenship until well into the 20th century in certain Western countries. France granted women with, franchise only in 1945. This is late, or this is recent, if you will. Were represented as intellectually inferior, better said, less rational in their relationship to the world, even if this was, so to speak, compensated for by an allegedly greater development of their intuitive and affective capacities, supposedly linked to the natural function of motherhood. Or extra-European races and cultures were represented as intellectually and morally underdeveloped, or perhaps sometimes we'll have to return to that, as embodying alternative patterns of development where the powers of imagination, the group feelings, and the mythical and aesthetic communication with nature were prevalent, supposedly, at the expense of scientific and organizational rationality. Summarizing, of course, a stereotyped discourse. These differences are essentialized, but also they become negative images of an ideal representation of the human essence, particularly embodied in the projection of a development of civilization as a movement of creation and pursuit of its own higher values, whose natural bearer is indeed the dominant figure of the white adult male proprietor. At this point, of course, the question becomes inevitable why I do not refer the patterns of domination which I describe in general terms and which tend to overlap or reinforce each other in the establishment of a single cultural norm to the usual structures of domination, patriarchy, capitalism, colonialism, etc. There are several reasons for that. Each can be weighed pro and contra. But essentially, I'm interested in the kind of double-bind situation in which excluded categories, which we can call minorities, generally speaking, even if they are extremely numerous, of course, find themselves when claiming inclusion in the very name of the universal, whose contradictory, self-defeating, discriminatory use they are denouncing. Namely, the usually impossible choice of demanding equality as a neutralization of differences, which, let us remark in passing, is perfectly compatible with a critique of the dominant Eurocentric masculinist values or normative representations, since it is certainly not impossible that their dominance, the dominance of these Eurocentric masculinist values was based on some sort of abusive generalization. And demanding, the other side of the dilemma, demanding equality as a recognition of differences, not a neutralization, but a recognition of differences, which is not exactly the same, I believe, as a recognition of the value of particularities, or in any case goes beyond, because the ultimate bearer of a difference is an individual. However tied to others he or she can be through different sorts of solidarities. It seems to me that this double bind, continuously experienced, as we know, of course, by emancipatory movements, or expressed in minoritarian voices who speak different, split languages in different moments, or for different interlocutors, which at some point in the recent debates has been called strategic essentialism, for example, has an intrinsic relationship to the ambivalence of the principle or proposition of equal liberty, which grounds civic universalism. Because it can be read also as a contradictory injunction to create an essential sameness of humans with respect to their public functions or destination, and to include every possible otherness in a virtually open, unended realm of the human, where every being with whom a communication or a reciprocity is established can count, in fact, as such. For this reason, in fact, I'm absolutely not excluding any of the causal chains and social structures with which the symbolic form of the civic universal can be associated, neither the legacy of secularized monotheistic discourse, Paulinian, for example, where the principled neutralization of differences among the faithful as creatures or children of God was compensated by the discriminatory procedures of forced conversion of the pagans and violent suppression of heretics, nor the parallelism between the universality of rights and the universality of the commodity form generalized by capitalism, which was particularly analyzed by Marx in celebrated developments on the fetishism of commodity, which is also a fetishism of the juridical subject, clearly, whose relevance, to say the least, is not diminished by the developments of contemporary global capitalism, instrumentalizing all sorts of differences as exchangeable and perishable objects of mass consumption. These historical legacies, monotheism, and economic structures, capitalism, are there, no doubt, civic, I have a problem with my text, are there, no doubt, yes, they are there. Civic universalism would neither exist nor develop its contradiction out of them. But it seems to me, and the same could be said of West European colonialism, but I cannot repeat every item at the same time. But it seems to me that these contradictions can become active and mobile only at the political level. That is, I repeat, on the one side as contradiction between the universalization of rights and its limitation in the name of nature, or the identification of the human with an exclusionary norm, and on the other side, as a double bind of emancipatory politics, which must both turn against the dominant institution of the political its own legal principles and vindicate the differences that have become into representations of inferiority, or liberate them from the naturalistic definitions which they have been imposed. Perhaps this justification of my project is tautological. It amounts to explaining that there is a political stake, a political conflict, a political differential only when exclusions and inclusions are formulated in a political language themselves. But perhaps also this tautology covers a precise difficulty which I would express by referring the issue of radical exclusions to the fact that citizenship, whether in the modern or the ancient sense, seems to exist only in the form of a community. To grant rights, which from a democratic point of view ultimately are never granted from above, not even by the state, but are rights that the citizens reciprocally grant or confer upon themselves, you must institute a community of citizens. But a community, however equalitarian it claims to be, or becomes under the impact of internal struggles, emancipatory movements, claims of rights, is always closed with respect to the outside and regulated or controlled from inside. we may suspect that the two aspects are never really separated, as the history of patriotism, nationalist feelings, and collective values in modern history may suggest, but more abstractly, because there is a deep affinity between the issue of collective identity, which results from the external closure or helps reproducing and protecting it, however imaginarily, and the issue of normality, which is involved in the governance and control of a population through laws and moral rules. Identity and normality are not logically identical, or better said, they are like a system of representation of the collective belonging, identity, and a system of constraints and ideals to adapt oneself more or less voluntarily to these representations, normality. Therefore, they are never really separable. Together, they account for the fact that even when anthropological differences are used and become instruments to maintain discriminations, it is not the law of the other or the law of otherness that is prevalent, but rather the law of the same, the imperative of sameness. A dominant model of the human is thus created, and some are thought and said to realize it, while others are supposed to be defective, which means that they live in permanent discord with their own ideal. This is not necessarily the worst case from the point of view of one's understandings of the subject's relationship to the universal. It can be creative, however uneasy it is bound, of course, to remain. I want now to return and conclude precisely to the subjective side by introducing a last hypothesis. I will formulate it in the following manner, which once again takes the form of an aporia. What characterizes anthropological differences as experienced by human subjects in a modern regime of civic universality is precisely the fact that they cannot become transformed into castes or status groups with fixed characteristics or essences, or if this tends to become the case under the influence of social categorizations and sometimes also protections, which create such human types, stereotypes, as the worker, the intellectual and the manual, the criminal, the child, the woman, the stranger, etc. These categories are always essentially unstable, or they permanently escape their formal definitions. It seems to me, and this is what I want to try and illustrate in the coming sessions, it seems to me that we should offer here a more in advance, a more dialectical formulation, which once again encompasses a double-bind situation by saying that what characterizes the human as it becomes reconfigured in the modern representation deriving from the civic universal is a double impossibility. There is an impossibility not to distinguish, differentiate, classify individual subjects or individual behaviors according to several essential or even essentialist dichotomies which impose, and I put all these words in brackets or with quotation marks, choices or bifurcations in a radical manner. Of course, at some point, I'll have, and I hope to be able to return to this in the last session or in the last lecture more generally, to reflect on the fact that all these choices seem always to be binary choices, the masculine and the feminine, the normal and the pathological, the manual and the intellectual, and so on, which so impose choices or bifurcations in a radical manner, such as the distinctions, the binary distinctions of the masculine and the feminine, or the normal and the pathological, or the manual and the intellectual activities, or the racially or ethnically identical and different. But there is an equal impossibility to define and fix, stabilize criteria, definitions, hence lines of demarcation for these distinctions, which would be stable, undisputable, which do not at some point appear arbitrary, reductive, and alienating, in fact. This hypothesis, or hypothetic generalization of our experience, is intimately linked with a reflection on the violence of the anthropological differences and the paradoxical characters of this violence. I'm not thinking only of the fact that all the anthropological differences to which I allude, reflecting dissymmetric relationship to the norm or to the model, are also indissociable, as we know, from power relations, which in some cases appear as simple hierarchies or relations of dependency, but in many cases, perhaps all of them also become violent or involve a structural violence, such as precisely the power of the masculine over the feminine, or the normal over the pathological, or the adults over the children, etc. But I am thinking of the fact, or the additional fact, if you like, that anthropological differences are precisely located between antithetic forms of violence which encompass or circumscribe their horizon permanently. Why that? Because you can always say that there is violence, even extreme violence, in the fact of denying the existence of the differences, imposing uniformity, or entirely subjecting one term to the model stated by the other, as so that it becomes only its lack or its defect, as in the famous positivistic definition of the pathological discussed by my master Georges Canguilhem, and now widely read, which makes it a quantitative variation of the normal. But you must also say that there is extreme violence in the fact of fixing the differences, of imposing criteria after which every behavior or every individual will have to be posited in a universal manner and once forever, either on one side or on the other side of the divide, without ambiguity or ambivalence or oscillation or transitional states. So the human species would be made of, categorized into men and women, presumably heterosexual, which crosses the sexual difference with the normal pathological difference. Ill and healthy people, honest humans and criminals, or bad guys, as you read in the newspapers. The other day, I returned to that, reading a recent description of a terrible criminal who has just been arrested or convicted. And of course, the psychiatrist was called to give his evaluation, his assessment. Is this guy a maniac? Is is he a pathological case? And the answer is no, he's just a bad guy. Whites and colored intellectuals and manuals, etc. But in fact, however sophisticated the medical, legal, educational, ethnographic criteria, nobody knows how to define such and fix such lines of demarcation in a univocal, undisputable manner, not even between the masculine and the feminine. And above all, nobody knows how to apply such criteria to oneself in an indisputable manner, in spite of the tremendous efforts that many of us display to identify with the normative rules, exigencies, and models associated with the dichotomies, because of the uneasiness of the intermediary or ambivalent position as such. So again, the violence is looming on both sides. The side of indifference or homogeneity, which is one way of destroying the human, and the side of the dichotomic inscription and imposition of difference, which is another way of making the human inhuman. We'll stop here, thanking you for your attention. The three colloquia that are coming, this is on the website, of course, on the program, will be devoted respectively, if I can completely isolate them from one another, and each time based on the supposed or perhaps allegoric reading of one text. First, colloquium number 1, to the interference of the notions of the criminal and of crime and madness as both antithetic and correlative modes of exclusion, essentially starting with a rereading, a fresh reading of some remarkable analysis by Foucault on this issue. The second, to the issue of, I hesitated between different names, but finally I'm opting for the notion of strangeness or the stranger, and especially the stranger from inside, with again a very disturbing oscillation in our modern history between racial and cultural ways of defining it. And of course, the third one, I don't say the most difficult, but for me at least, perhaps in a sense, to sex. Thank you very much.